You are listening to Missed Apex Podcast. We live F1.
Welcome to Missed Apex Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Trumpets, and today we will be talking all things tech. So, coming up, we'll discuss how many rear wings are too many rear wings, what surprises the 26 regulations might have, why DRS size does matter, and we will put a neat little bow on the 24 season by deciding who really had the best car. But first, a reminder, we are an independent podcast produced in the podcasting shed with the kind support of our patrons and partners. We aim to bring you a race review before your Monday morning commute. We might be wrong, but we're first. And today we are joined by that titan of technical F1 and technical editor at motorsport.com, Matthew Somerfield, aka Summers F1. Welcome back to the shed, Summers.
Lovely to be back and lovely to be talking to you once again, Matt.
Yeah, I bet it's nice to be indoors in all the chilly weather we're having right now.
Yeah, cold, windy. What more can you want for this time of the year?
Yes, well, it is kind of appropriate, but weather is one of the things we're going to talk about. So if we can get started, I'd like to dive into some little rule changes for the 25 season. And we've had some, which is not the most unusual things, but there were only two that really caught my attention. So let's start with, I think, the most obvious one, which is we had a lot of talk after the first inaugural race in Qatar about issues with driver cooling. And now we've seen added to the regs official prescriptions for when and how driver cooling has to be used.
Yeah, so obviously that first race was difficult for the drivers in terms of the heat exhaustion that they faced at that particular race. And there were actually already some measures put into place for this year. So we've had an extra driver cooling slot available for the drivers throughout the course of the season. And although that was optional, a lot of the teams have continued to run it right the way through the season, some of them covering it when they don't want the aero upset by the inlets, etc. But on the whole, that has been adopted, and the teams have had it at their disposal. But obviously, there are some additional measures coming in, which means some additional weight on the car. But again, we have to think about safety measures, and obviously, this particular change in the regulations is fully focused on safety.
And that brings up, in a manner that I can only think of as being constructive criticism, that rather than use the wet bulb temperature as a guide for when this had to be used, they've simply said above 30.5 C, and you have to install it. I don't suppose you have any insight onto why they chose to go that way, which, I mean, admittedly will probably cover off almost every time you might need it. But why they decided not to use the wet bulb temperature instead. And just real quick for people who are listening, wet bulb is the point at which things evaporating won't make you, basically things stop evaporating. So you can't cool yourself with sweat. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think it's just a line in the sand, a measurement that they've appropriated for this particular purpose, to be perfectly honest. And obviously, there has to be some way of coming up with that measurement. There are obviously other factors involved in that temperature valuation as well, with things like altitude, etc., which is something that I don't think many people really ever consider with Formula One, and the way that obviously it's a global sport, and every time you go to different circuit, we're at a race at a different altitude, and obviously that will have an impact in that respect as well. So that's probably one of the reasons why they've just drawn a line in the sand at the temperature rating in respect of dealing with this heat hazard, as they're calling it.
A line in the sand. I see what you did there.
Yeah, I'll get my bucket and spade.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I will ask, the 5 kilogram weight limit, is that something you think the teams might be able to assist in ballasting? I mean, you know, if it was me, I would put all my cooling equipment right over the tip of the nose and say, yep, that's exactly where all my cooling equipment goes now, because that's going to help the car turn better.
Well, if there's an advantage to be gained, somebody's already thought about how to gain it. So if that's possible, it's definitely happening.
All right, then. So let's talk about the one that really is going to matter a lot more. And they have yet again, even though they're getting rid of it soon enough, they've changed the rules about the DRS slot gaps. So what's going on with that exactly?
Okay, so this is all about how much that the DRS opens its upper boundary in terms of, that once the flap is actually open and then when it closes. And the obvious application reason for this particular introduction into the rules is mini DRS, which was uncovered at the Azerbaijan Grand Prix this season in 2024. This is just that being covered off by the FIA in order that other teams don't feel the need to be able to come up with a similar solution, even though it's supposedly not possible or banned. We all know that rules are rules and technical directives are just the opinion of somebody behind the scenes. And so there could be some argument to say that even though the rules don't technically permit what was considered to be mini DRS anyway, without this new change in the regulations, you could technically still run something similar. And this is just to cover off that particular incident and draw a line under it.
Okay, so just help me understand, because they have done two things. One, they've changed some actual measurements. Not by a lot, but by a little. Is the intent of that just to reduce the inevitable separation that will occur with aeroelasticity, i.e. flexi bits?
Yeah, so obviously the slot gap will naturally gravitate based on the load deformation on the wing. So you will get some change in the actual height of that slot gap along its length. And that is obviously primarily why they're trying to prevent that. They've given an actual measurement now of between 10 and 15 millimeters, I believe it is, in order to prevent, an excessive amount of change in the slot gap. Because in years gone by, let's say, back in the early 2000s, what teams were doing is there was actually creating a situation where there was no slot gap. In other words, the wing would be, I hate to use the word stall, but most people would in this situation stall the wing purely on the fact that you've got the two elements colliding with one another and there's no way of the airflow permeating the gap anymore. So that's when slot gap separators were introduced. And that, as the FIA understood it, would reduce the chances of that from happening again in the future. But as obviously the regulations are iterated on from one year to the next, you end up in a situation where the teams push back and look for ways to reinterpret the regulations and find advantages and loopholes within what is currently written. And that's all this was, is a case of, this is possible. Let's see how far we can push the line before it's not possible anymore.
Right. And I find it hilarious that they figured out how to stall the wings that way. And the FIA said, no, we're not going to let you do that. We're going to make you separate the wings. And now they figured out how to take advantage of that. And the FIA is now moving back towards where they initially were. And all of it's going to be absolutely fine in 2 years anyway. So it's just, it's kind of funny and wild to me to sort of see this pendulum swing back and forth as the teams seek advantage. The other thing they talked about, and in this, and you talked about like returning to the initial mode, like how is that going to work? Because wasn't that kind of already in the regulations? And this reality intrudes here. If you're going 350 kilometers an hour at Monza, you were going to have deformation no matter how rigidly you build that structure. And if you don't, it's just going to break.
Yeah, I think this comes more down to how the different segments of the wing actually come back into rest with one another. If you look at the design of some of the wings on the grid currently, you have sort of a notch in which that the upper flap will rest back into. Now, you could technically, I guess, design your wing to flex in a way that it doesn't fully rest back into the closed position fully, gaining you this type of advantage. And I think that's where they're just trying to cover off that part of the misunderstanding, let's say, of how you could actually deal with the on and off mode of DRS being applied.
The gray zone, our favorite zone in the technical side of things. Now, obviously, this brings us to the real question here, and I'm going to have to apologize if you're fans of other teams, but the reason we're really talking about this is because McLaren got flagged up for being excessively, jubilant about using this. And first of all, how exactly did they get caught? How is the FIA checking on this? And secondly, does this then suggest that they were actually getting a fairly big advantage because of all the accusations we've seen tossed back and forth over the course of this season? This is the only one that's made it into next season's rules being modified.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you're talking about certain other discussions that have been had regarding flexible wings already in 2024. You know, a hot topic that we've discussed on many occasions over probably the last, 5 or 6 years anyway.
I think the word is evergreen. This discussion is evergreen.
Yeah, I mean, it's always going to happen. You've got a flexible target limit on load deflection, and you've got people that are trying to avoid getting the load to be shown in a certain way. But regardless of that, the way that the FIA have tried to deal with this in the past, and again, this is falling back to Azerbaijan, 2017, if memory serves correctly, was the last time that... No, 2021, sorry, was the last time we had this. And it was slightly different. And it was because at that point in time, there was some discussions regarding certain teams having rear wings that flexed backwards under load. So the whole rear wing assembly was flexing backwards. And that was obviously reducing the amount of drag on the straights. Now, the FIA came up with a semi-solution to that problem, in as much as that they had teams add 6 dots to the rear wing. You can see them if you look at pictures. They're usually a different colour to the livery that's on the car itself. And those dots would be monitored by the rear-facing camera. Now, in as much as that's something that cannot be used as a means to say that wing is illegal, it was a method for the FIA to be able to look at it and say, this is maybe a little bit more than we were expecting it to be. Somebody's doing something they shouldn't, etc., etc. So it was more of a self-policing mechanism introduced by the FIA, in as much as we're watching you. Do you dare go beyond the scope of what we say should be relevant? However, obviously, with this particular instance of mini DRS, it was a different method to be able to reduce drag, which is what mini DRS was essentially looking to do. And it appears that the FIA hadn't really picked up on it because it was a different method, and they weren't seeing the level of deflection with these specific dots on the rear wing. Obviously, since this point, when mini DRS happened and the FIA have decided that it wasn't particularly something they wanted to see, they've added more dots to the rear wing now, and they're self-policing it a little bit more stringently to see what the teams are up to. And furthermore, obviously, because of what happened earlier in the season with many of the teams reporting that the front wings were flexing too much, we've also got a case of those dots now being on the front wing end plates and the front wing flaps themselves, and that is also monitored during a free practice session from the cameras that are mounted on the nose of the car. There's actually some specific cameras that have been put in place by the FIA for that specific job as well. But regardless of that, that is only done in FP1. After that, the teams have a little bit more free reign. So make of that what you will if you've got a certain wing that works one way and a certain wing that works another. But yeah, we've ended up in a situation where the FIA have tried to allow the teams some rope so that they can then hang themselves when the FIA then go back and say, hang on a minute, you're not quite playing the game correctly here. Let's just have a conversation.
Yeah, and I was kind of interested that McLaren in this instance was like, yeah, no, fine, yeah, we'll make changes to keep everybody else happy. A bit of a surprise, unless they knew that, or they highly suspected that eventually someone would flag it up and they would need a different solution. But they did get some time, unlike Ferrari with the skid blocks. Say they did get some time to bring that in. Which is that learning by the FIA?
Well, I think the FIA have become better at understanding that teams can't simply say, we've not got a different rear wing we can use, or we've not got the X or Y that we can't use. And there has been cases where a technical directive has essentially been sent out to teams in discussion of something that might not have been being done correctly before it has been changed in the regulations, and there's a latency period that has allowed them to catch up to that. So in other words, we know you're technically running outside the bounds of what we are interested in, but we're going to give you 2 races to get it right. And it would appear that McLaren were kind of in this situation at one point, but then we had the likes of Red Bull and Ferrari step heavily into the spotlight and say, this isn't on. We've always been told that this isn't something we can do. And if you don't rectify the situation with McLaren, we're going to go to war and build our own. And if we build our own, let's just hope that it's not actually 5 times better than McLaren's. Because as we know, that tends to be the route that teams take. The first iteration of something is always very good in one way, but then the teams know how to develop and iterate that concept to be able to build their own and better versions of that.
Yeah, and I would like to know then, as we get ready to sort of move on from this very, very technical discussion, is it going to be the case always that the FIA is essentially relying on the other teams to do a lot of this sort of, I call it soft scrutineering, for lack of a better word? Like the FIA is simply going to assume this isn't a problem. Teams know they might be monitored, but that if there's something that's really egregious, I'll use a big fancy word here, something really egregious, they're going to hear about it because the other teams will be always paying attention and will notice it and will flag it up for them.
I think it also falls on the sword of, do we know specifically what's happening here and how big is the advantage that has been gained by this particular innovation? Let's say we're talking about mini DRS in this situation. Do we know how many kilometres per hour that this particular innovation is giving McLaren as an advantage over the other teams? And if we know that and we're still allowing it, then it's okay. If we don't know that and it's over the bounds, do we reel them in? Now, the big thing here, for me at least, is that this became somewhat of a situation that unravelled because of the furore that happened on social media regarding this particular thing appearing. I mean, I don't want to say I was the first, but I was the one on Twitter that said, hang on a minute, what the hell is this? To which point then there was a cascade situation happen, or should we call it a pylon, of many other people, fans, etc., following on down the path. And it was at that point, a few days later, that we saw the teams go, hang on a minute, what's this? Why haven't we noticed it? And what are we going to do about it? And it was very much a political battle behind the scenes to get something removed from a car that they knew was creating an advantage, that they knew would take time, money, resources in that point of the season where you don't really want to spend any of it to get their own version of it. So, as Ron Dennis used to say, if you can't beat them, get it thrown out in the FIA.
Racing by other means is what I call that. And so I take it you are now no longer getting free passes to the McLaren Technology Center to look at things.
I'm not sure that I'm not sure that anybody really copped on to the fact that maybe I was one of the first people to notice this thing. I think it because the way it snowballed, other people perhaps did, get
more
advantage.
Complaining about it.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, I don't care. I mean, it was so obvious to me when I saw it, though. I was on it. What I do during a race weekend, you see, Matt, is I will watch the race from the FOM's point of view, from the main camera feed, and then I'll also watch an onboard or several onboards, and just flick through those just to see what action's going on, etc. And obviously, what happened in this particular incident is that I flicked onto Piastri's onboard because he was battling at the time with Leclerc, and FOM flashed up the onboard from the rear view camera. And I'm looking at the thing, and I looked at it for about 30 seconds, and I'm like, what is going on here? Why has nobody seen this before? And is it broken? My initial thinking was, is this rear wing broken? But then obviously it becomes more and more obvious as to what's going on. And I think we're going to get into a bit of a discussion about McLaren and rear wings in a moment, but the one critical factor to think about here is that Azerbaijan is the moment it was noticed. It was not the moment that it wasn't the first time that this wing had been used. Let's put it that way. So the advantage had already been taken by McLaren at this point.
Yeah, and they got to keep it for a nice long time. I'm laughing about your personal involvement, and I'm wondering, like, have you bothered to bill the FIA for your time yet?
No. Like I said, yeah. I'm not sure I was particularly the first, but I was certainly there on the scene, let's say, spotting it in real time and just scratching my head to think, how has nobody else cottoned onto this? And why has nobody thought about it before? Technically, from a technical standpoint, why has nobody pressed this part of the regulations and figured it out?
Oh, well, actually, I love that, because I want to move on and talk about who we think had the best car this season. Not necessarily maximize their result, but who we think genuinely had the best car for the season. But it suggests to me, and correct me if I'm wrong here, it suggests that McLaren had this thought, and it was a very unique thought about how to approach taking advantage of it that none of the other teams had. Therefore, they were not looking out for it. Like, we know with the water in the tires, that was something Red Bull had done. So that was something they were, always going to have in the back of their mind as a possibility. And here, no one had ever thought of it before. So I think that's just like a little chapeau to McLaren and their clever engineers.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to a discussion we've had in the past about ideas that are sat in a drawer somewhere, and they work at that particular moment for that particular set of regulations, but it might be not effective from a cost point of view to chase that very small advantage that might be gained. However, if you know about that and it's in that drawer of ideas, it doesn't mean that you can't open that drawer again when the regulations change, and it actually adds more advantage to something that you've looked at in the past. So I think that's very critical when you think about how teams develop and how teams have team members move between different teams, and the way that intellectual property moves between the various teams up and down the grid.
That is, I'm just going to throw in an interesting sidelight, because Franz Tost, I remember, complaining bitterly about the excessively long gardening leaves that are now standard. They're standardized, and they're standard because of the relationship of Ferrari and Haas. When Haas first entered the sport, there was a very long stewards decision that made all of this. But what it essentially means is that if you get a senior member of another team, it's a season and a half before they can have any actual impact. So it slows the midfield teams from catching up. It accentuates the field spread. I'm not saying there should be no gardening leave, but if field spread is important, then that's maybe a place where things can be optimized a little bit.
Okay, so then I've got an idea for you, Matt.
Okay.
They should change the regulations in the same way that we have the CFD and wind tunnel regulations. And so if you work for Team A and you want to move to Team Z, it takes a disproportionate amount of time to move from one team to another. And then you could have a great engineer working for Ferrari that would take longer to move to a smaller team, or vice versa, based on where they are in the championship.
So if I'm at, let's say, Red Bull or this year McLaren, and I go to Sauber, because I like Mattia and I know he'll have the best espresso on the grid. I can get there very rapidly. But if I'm at Ferrari and I want to go to McLaren, well, I'm going to have to sit on my hands for a while and work in the old garden. I kind of like that's an interesting idea. I'm sure the FIA is listening to this and will implement it post haste.
Maybe not, though.
Yeah, maybe not. All right, so let's talk about the 24 season. We have seen the conclusion. McLaren won, not by a lot. Ferrari almost pulled it off. And we have to talk about Red Bull a little bit because they led for a very long time. So if we're talking about the best car on the grid, of those three, which one do you think it is and why is it McLaren?
Why is it all three, but at different times in the year?
You're gonna do that. Okay, nuance, context, great. Well, bring it on then.
Okay, so you would have to argue that in the front end of the season, that Red Bull, albeit having a car that was perhaps difficult to set up and that disadvantaged one of their drivers, was the better car. The RB20 was the better car. However, I think they not only had problems in terms of the development of the car and adding performance, they also had the problems of bouncing, which they hadn't had throughout the course of this regulation set since since it came in 2022, and all of a sudden they understood perhaps some of the problems that some of their rivals had had with those issues early on. So they fell into some of the traps that their competitors had. On the back end of that, you've also got two other teams that are giving them more trouble than they've ever had through the course of this set of regulations. Because let's say 22, 23 were won at pretty much at a canter. 24 is certainly not that case. And for a long period of time in the back end of the season, it did look like Lando could potentially catch Max. But if we are just purely looking at the car, I think the big waypoint is Miami. It was the point in the season where McLaren bought their biggest upgrade to the car, and it completely unlocked a new dimension for them in terms of both aerodynamic performance and from the chassis side of things, which obviously then bleeds into how you use the power unit as well. And then in Austria, they had a new front wing as well, which again, I think really just highlighted how good that McLaren have become in developing parts that work as well as they should do from the simulation tools, which has been a problem under this set of regulations for everybody. However, I would say that Red Bull have suffered the least in that respect because obviously the margin that they had available to them. And in terms of Ferrari, well, Ferrari have dipped in and out of form, haven't they, really? They've really had red-hot form when they're good with the tyres and then terrible form when they're bad with the tyres. So they've sort of yo-yoed in and around there. And I do think the car was potentially the best at certain events, but it was very specifically around the downforce configuration and how they got the best out of the tyres compared to their competitors at that time.
Okay, so first of all, I'm going to flag up that you used the word upgrade for McLaren at Miami, and I got to say, that is a massive compliment because it was an upgrade. It did qualify as an upgrade because it made the car better. But my counterpoint, and on a slightly more serious note, if we're going to argue about the best car in the season, yeah, I agree with you because it's hard not to, that Red Bull clearly dominated the first races of the season. But my understanding was that McLaren made sort of a strategic decision, like once again, as they had done previously, to say, look, we are going to start with essentially the bare bones of the car we ultimately want to build. And we understand that the choice we're making is to have everything ready by the fifth or sixth race, whenever Miami was. And that's really our competitor. So was Red Bull facing any real opposition at that? Is it fair to compare them to McLaren when McLaren straight up said, this isn't really our car yet? I think if you're saying, well, like, oh, I'm late to work. Well, you're late to work. Yes. But if we're talking about the best car across the course of the season, shouldn't you be looking at that Red Bull versus that McLaren?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're going toe to toe, I think you have to pull the Ferrari out of that pack of cards because, as I say, it's very circumstantial as to when that car was actually the best car on the grid. Yes, it was, but for very, very small windows of opportunity. And it was also when their opposition kind of just weren't there at the races as quickly as Ferrari were. So, yeah, I do think that that's the case. The Red Bull very much was the best car until Miami, at which point then you got the update package come along for McLaren, unlocked the potential of the car, and then allowed them to go toe-to-toe with Red Bull for a considerable portion of the season. But if I had to be completely honest about which was the best car of the season, you would have to point at the McLaren, because irrespective of the fact that it didn't really kick off until Miami, for the rest of the season it was probably better than the Red Bull, just purely because it had the performance envelope at every single race. There was situations where the Red Bull just didn't have any performance whatsoever, and it was down the pack, even with Mercedes and Ferrari, leaping up above them. So I do think it was the McLaren over the course of the entire season, but I do think that the big waypoint development situation for McLaren helped them out massively in that respect, and unlocked what was already a fairly decent baseline car, and gave it a huge amount of performance on top of that. And again, I think this also stems back to how teams approach development throughout the course of the season, with McLaren taking a slightly different approach to some of their rivals.
Yeah, I want to get into that a little bit because, if we're going to talk about all three of them, why is Ferrari in there when, as you say, and I'd be curious as to like what your specific conditions were, like the races where you saw them clearly best. But what struck me about Ferrari, and the only reason I really include them there, if you look at their season, of all three of those teams, they were the most consistently least bad. They weren't often fastest or best, but of the top three teams, they were consistently least worst, which sounds kind of funny, but you win championships on your bad days, not your good days. And with the exception of Canada and Silverstone, their point scoring across both cars was really quite consistent. And so that's why I included them. But that was like a lower boundary kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a baseline at the end of the day. I think one of the things that perhaps we should talk about, and perhaps is something that people don't really get on board or understand because it's a nuanced thing and it hides in the weeds behind the back of everything else that's going on. Obviously, I've talked in the past about how development schedules operate and how you have to line that up logistically as well because of how long it takes to ship things by freight or, the different methods that things get to race circuits. But the other thing that I think is incredibly important is the aerodynamic testing periods. So if you're not aware of what one of those is, I'll call it an ATP because that's what they call it in the regulations as well. They are periods within the calendar whereby you have a set amount of percentage versus the coefficient for wind tunnel and CFD usage. So if you are the best team on the grid, you only get 70% of the coefficient. If you are the worst team on the grid, you get 110%. And it's a sliding scale from one end to the other with 5% increments in between. So if we take the start of the season, which is the first period, there's actually 6 now in the season. There used to be, when this rule first applied, you reset in the middle of the season. So you had 2 ATPs, and that made things incredibly difficult for teams to catch up with. This now being in 6 increments has kind of made it a little bit more applicable to the development over the course of the season, and also has an impact into the following season. So if I take McLaren as the example here, because obviously we've already made the claim that they perhaps had the best development throughout the course of the season and had the best car. ATP period 1 runs until the 4th of March, which is Bahrain being the last Grand Prix of that period, at which point McLaren was still 4th in the Constructors' Championship, because that's where they'd finished the previous season. So the end of the previous season, you start the next season from where you finished. The next waypoint would have been China, where they'd moved up to third. They were still third come Spain, but by the time they got to Monza, they were second in the Constructors' Championship, and by the time they got to Brazil, they were first. So it's taken an entire season almost. You know, Brazil, I think, is that race 18, 19 in the calendar from the top of my head, maybe even further. It might be 20. It's taken that long for them to get into first place on the ATP, which means that they have slid only a few percentage points relative to their rivals, which means that they've had more CFD and wind tunnel time than their rivals to be able to help to develop the upgrades that have gone onto the car. And this, I think, is part of the reason as to why they have outdeveloped those around them, because they have the capacity to do so, because they are still considered to be one of the top teams. They're able to meet the upper perimeter of the cost cap. And obviously they have a new wind tunnel. So they've made advantage of all of these things that have fell into their lap. However, will that bite them in 2025? Because now they sit in first place. The last 2 ATPs they've sat in first place, and they'll start the first part of the season at least in first place. And so they'll have a disadvantage in terms of development compared to their rivals. So this is where the to and fro behind the scenes that people perhaps don't ever really think about will start to make a difference when it comes to the development race between, say, McLaren, Red Bull, Mercedes, and Ferrari.
Okay, so just for the record, you are not intentionally implying that McLaren made a strategic decision based on testing time to tank the first part of their season and take their sweet time getting to the top to take maximum leverage of the obviously amazing correlation they have going on right now. Because if you looked at the end of the 23 season, you're like, oh, they're right there. They're just going to, even if they just took the 23 car, surely they'd be right there. And no, in fact, they were not. But when you put it like that, it seems like if I was running a team and I knew I had that correlation working for me, and I knew I could sort of, you know, just parse it out in just the correct manner, that by the end of the season I win, but I can get maximum leverage in the meantime out of not being in first place, well, then that makes them look even kind of more clever, doesn't it?
It does. And the tinfoil hat brigade behind the scenes might also consider that one team in particular only had one driver in the championship and have slid down the pecking order to a point whereby they will now be advantaged going into 25 and 26 when you actually need those resources at your disposal so that you can run parallel development programs.
Yeah, and I think that brings us right back to McLaren being the best car. It simply is the best car in a lot of ways, because unlike Red Bull, who we saw make a horrible turn with their development approach, and even Ferrari stumbled, although they seem to have figured out what caused the stumble. And I'm not convinced that Red Bull has. I haven't heard enough to know one way or the other. McLaren never did. And part of that might be the new wind tunnel helping them out a lot compared to where they were previously.
Yeah, I do think it has made a big difference to McLaren in terms of how they're able to get things from the tunnel to the car that correlate quite well. And I think part of the reason for that is that unlike some of the other teams, they've stumbled upon the methodology to work out how to bring in a floor update that works. Now, that is the most critical issue with this particular set of regulations. And I think it's where the likes of Red Bull and Ferrari perhaps have stumbled throughout the course of this season, because it is the most sensitive area of the car. And if you're to extract performance, sometimes you can't extract all of the performance that is possible because it's only possible over a very small window. So you want to be less dramatic with the design concept in order to extract the full performance from it. And I think what is telling there is that McLaren themselves admitted that they'd got a floor update available to them sitting in the wings, and they didn't want to put it on the car because they knew that it was a little bit more aggressive than what they'd had in the past. And was it going to work? Was it going to correlate with the information that they'd got back at the factory, and with a situation where you have less testing, as we've had over the course of the last few years, bringing things to car real world terms, sometimes you need more time, and when you're in a championship battle, you don't have that time.
Indeed. Now, you have found out something that I personally am amazed at, and you've written an article about it. So I'm just going to bring it up now because we are talking about McLaren. It seems like to me that if I was looking for a statistic to predict who's going to win the Constructors' Championship, I might start with the number of rear wing, beam wing combinations a team produces in a single season.
Well, it is a considerable factor, in as much as that if you think about 24 races on the calendar, all 24 of those races have very different characteristics about them, the circuit themselves. So you can't really say, yes, it's a high downforce, a low downforce, or a medium downforce circuit, because there's more specificity to it than just that. If we're looking at high downforce, you'd obviously look at Monaco, Hungary, and maybe even Singapore, historically at least, in that respect. And if you were looking at extreme low downforce circuits, you'd obviously look at Monza and Las Vegas. Now, obviously, if you've got wings on those ends of the spectrum, you've got both ends of that covered. You've then got to look at something in the middle, and you've got to design around those things. And that is typically how everybody has worked this season. They've gone for 4 real specifications of wings, and then they've worked around that. Now, the interesting thing with McLaren is that they obviously, as we've already discussed, had some development scope in pocket. And I think they used that to be able to design and develop a huge array of rear wings and beam wings, especially if you compare it to their rivals. So Red Bull had 5 rear wing iterations and 4 beam wings. Mercedes had 5 of each. Now, Ferrari, I'll give it to them. They had 8 beam wings and 8 rear wings. So I'm not saying that all of those things work together. You can mix and match things to try to create the right level of downforce and drag, the right efficiency for each particular circuit. However, 14 beam wings and 8 rear wings for McLaren during the course of the season, which gives them a huge difference in the ability to set their car up for the very specific nature of each circuit. And obviously also gives them some options when they get to a circuit where they're a little bit stuck. Do we go this way or do we go that way? Well, we've got the option. Other teams perhaps didn't have that option. So I think that is one of those sort of in-between storylines of the season from a technical perspective that McLaren have been very clever about how they approached that side of development. I mean, I've actually got the list of which wings did what specific thing, because it's clever how they actually started out with one spec in, say, a mid to low downforce and then had a new mid to low downforce towards the end of the season. So they've found an efficiency gain during the course of the season as well, which they then took to those particular circuits. So a very, very interesting development program that McLaren undertook on that respect.
Well, and I find it interesting as well when you just first shared those numbers with me. I was like blown away, because I'm very used to teams looking for performance very much with their front wings. And in this particular regulation set, a lot of attention to floor edge detail. And for McLaren to have somehow designed a car where they can find these performance gains at the back, which obviously, I think if I'm right, that helps extract air from the diffuser. So that might explain why they're spending so much time back there. But to have that fine level of control seems like a huge advantage compared to their rivals.
Yeah, I mean, I think it realistically comes down to having a very good baseline car. A car whereby it can do a wide spectrum of performance across the different circuit characteristics, and then you use the different trim levels to be able to, create the scenario that you're looking for at a given circuit. So the interesting thing is that, as I say, they started off with what I call Variant 1, which did Bahrain, Japan, China, Canada, and Austria, which I would consider to be their mid to high downforce configuration. But then abandoned that wing entirely. It didn't get seen again for the rest of the season because they'd bought in a new one called Variant 7, which did the Dutch, Singapore, USA, Mexico, the race in Brazil, and Qatar. So, you've effectively started the season with one rear wing that's designated for a certain type of circuit, and then found efficiency gains and have swapped that out for something else. And I think that's perhaps an area where they had a big advantage over their rivals, is that they just had a very good baseline car that they were able to then trim to the circuit characteristics and gain performance on each race by race basis.
Okay, so I understand we only have a certain amount of time on this show. I'm being told, my producer is telling me right now, and I am very much stuck on this discussion because I'm enjoying it so much. But I do want to take, there are 3 other teams I just want to ask you about in general, and it's along the same basis. One of them is Aston Martin, who I think we can all agree just, despite finishing 5th, managed to thoroughly disappoint everyone based on what we might have expected. They do have a new wind tunnel coming in. So do you see that as potentially a game changer for them next season, or has there just been so much churn now in the technical side of things that you might expect sort of another holding season from them?
Yeah, I mean, I think 2026 is when we perhaps might see Aston Martin make another big, bold move. I think if you look at the way that they developed their car this season, they tended to operate on a different sort of development strategy compared to many of their rivals. I think they were more or less trying to figure out the foibles of this car to obviously improve and redesign the car going into 2025. A sacrificial year, let's say. But I do think 26 is where they will throw all the eggs in that particular basket, especially as obviously from the 1st of January 2025, they'll be able to work on that particular car in CFD and the wind tunnel. But yeah, obviously, I think there was a false dawn with Aston Martin when they arrived with this new regulation set and were immediately on semi-on pace with Red Bull. And I think that kind of gave everybody the hope that perhaps they'd cut through some of their issues from the past and would be able to bring that going forward. But that kind of stalled. And I think they've had issues not only of their own making. I think one of the big issues that perhaps both themselves and Mercedes face this year is the gearbox that they share. And unfortunately, I think that has played into both some mechanical and aerodynamic constraints for both teams. And I think obviously that should be rectified going into 25 because obviously Mercedes will be looking to make some changes themselves there, and that will bleed on to Aston as well. So it'd be interesting to see if both of those teams make a leap forward in some ways because of that situation. But yeah, Aston Martin are one of those teams where I think we're going to have to wait a little bit longer to get the maximum from them.
All right, you're going to have to explain the gearbox thing real quick. What was the issue that you saw with it cause, of course, across Mercedes and Aston? Like, I mean, it's a gearbox. I get it's finicky, but really, how did that mess them up so badly?
Okay, so we're not talking about the gearbox in reality. The gearbox is just a cassette that lives within the rear crash structure and has the rear suspension mounted to it, etc. So in reality, more or less what I'm talking about is rear suspension issues in terms of traction, deliverable downforce because of the traction issues, and just an exacerbation of that leading into other areas of facets of design of the car. So I think to say gearbox is probably incorrect, but obviously that's how we associate that component because it's shared between both teams.
Okay, so that is interesting because if I'm remembering right, it was Ferrari discovering at a race that they were having they had these super mini wheel spin issues, like incredibly short millisecond loss of traction. And that was actually part of what was really giving them issues with their tires. And I can't remember how it came about that they discovered it. It was either a cold enough race, someone finally saw something on telemetry, but in essence, the way power was being delivered to the rear wheels was fundamentally munching their tires, which does sound a lot like a long-term Mercedes issue, doesn't it?
It does sound very much like a Mercedes issue, doesn't it, Matt? And I didn't really want to use the word tyres because we all know it's been banned by Mr. Spanners.
Yes, no, I think we've done very well to get this far into the show and not talk about tires, although there's definitely some tire testing that went on we could talk about. But I have one more question for you. And I think the battle that became most exciting for everybody in the midfield was the one between Alpine and Haas. And so irrespective of how that turned out, of those two cars, like which one would you choose going forward, looking at how the season turned out?
Would this be the most interesting part for you, Matt, because you like a certain French driver that's moving from one French team to one American team?
I am the host of the show, and I can ask any question I want.
To answer the question, though, I think Alpine have been in the weeds for a very long time. We've had this discussion in the past about their strategy moving forward and how a lot of what goes on there has been mismanaged in the past. Obviously, we know the news about Alpine's decision not to run a 2026 power unit of their own making anymore, which obviously is a very strange decision from a manufacturer's point of view. But I do understand where they're going with that in terms of budget constraints, etc., especially when they are literally the only team running that power unit. And it must be very difficult to do the development side of it when you've not got all the data that all the other teams have got because you're the only ones running it. I think, and that also is an interesting one because at the back end of this season, and I think we've seen this from Alpine or Renault or whatever you want to call them in the past, we've seen it from them in the past. They get to the back end of the season and all of a sudden they find loads of performance from the power unit as if they're just like, well, just turn it up and it doesn't matter if we break it. But we didn't break it, so let's see if that works again in the future. I mean, I know they had the Gasly issue this time around with something along those lines. But in terms of development from Alpine this year, they have, like Haas, thrown some development at the car towards the end of the season that will play into 2025 because they've started to look at concepts that carry forward, things that other teams ahead of them had already got on their cars, and they've gone, we need to have a look at this to see if it works for us. And if it does, we need to experiment now because then we can continue to develop those ideas and those concepts onto the 2025 car. So I think Alpine certainly should be better in 25 from that side of things. However, I do think obviously they've got a bit of an issue when it comes to the power unit side, whereas Haas, again, did well in terms of development last season, or this season, should I say. But again, it comes down to them and the way that they do have a very different development schedule to the other teams. You know, we don't see them bring very much to the car at all. And then all of a sudden they've got one big package. They put that on the car. If it works, fantastic. If it doesn't, oh, damn, we've got to go back to the drawing board or we've got to make this work because we spent all this money on it. So it's a very difficult churn for teams in that midfield pack to be able to find performance against the pack ahead of them. And making a bold leap into the pack ahead is probably not on the cards for them in this particular regulation set. And I do think those two teams will probably spend a big bulk of their time during 25 trying to develop the 26 car to take a leap forward.
Well, I'm just going to share this because I was reading up for the show, and they had an interview with Bernardo talking about Sauber and saying that one of the biggest things that hadn't been invested in for Sauber was their simulation tools. And this is not the first time we've heard discussion about how important these simulation tools are. And this is not just the one that the driver sits in. This covers a lot of different stuff. They simulate everything from how much oil they need based on the amount of G's and turns to how engine performance and obviously cooling, radiator, stuff like that, all of this gets simulated. And the thing that strikes me is the deal that Haas has done with Toyota, by my reading of what both Toyota and Haas have said about it, is they are going to be using a lot of Toyota simulation tools. And I think that might assist them in unlocking performance. But I was surprised by Haas's performance across the whole season. And the Alpine didn't surprise me as much because I felt like in a lot of ways they were finishing up with what had been the original plans of a really good technical staff, Matt Harmon, et cetera, all of whom have left. And I don't know how much of what we saw at the end of the season was simply a fulfillment of their plans that couldn't be ready for the start of the season, and how much might have been contribution from the people who've either been brought in or stepped up within the team.
Yeah, it's a latency thing, isn't it? Because as we were talking about earlier, what happens from a development perspective doesn't always meet the car for several months. And so you end up in this situation when you've got staff incoming and outgoing where you've got no idea as to how much has come from one department found performance on the car. So Alpine and Haas very much fall into those categories because, as you mentioned, that relationship that Haas are going to have with Toyota is very interesting from a technical standpoint, and hopefully should deliver them some more performance going forward. But I think where they will really capitalise on that is going into 26. Just going back through 24 on Haas, what also was very interesting is how they split their development between both drivers. So we've known this obviously for many seasons in the past where one driver gets a package of updates and the other one simply doesn't. And that was the case at Haas for many points throughout the course of the season. They threw their eggs into the Hulkenberg basket and didn't really give Magnussen a run at the new car every step of the way. So he was the one always getting the newer parts first. And that might be the reason why, there looks always to be a difference in the quality of both drives.
I always love it when you bring little tidbits like that, because Magnussen is just one of my favorite drivers, especially on the radio. He's hilarious sometimes. But it's nice to get that context when you see such an unusual discrepancy in scores of drivers that generally you would class as being, generally on par with each other skill-wise. So you keep on talking about 25 and tires. We did have a tire test. And while I don't want to get too much into that, we see that we do have a new tire, the C6, that did not work quite how Pirelli thought. But what I really want to ask you about is the testing is also interesting because a lot of teams will try and sneak some 25 gear into a free practice so that they can run it afterwards and get some data on it. So did we get any 25 peaks on any cars?
Yes, no, maybe. The one thing that I think might not be appreciated is how much sensor work is put into the cars for that last race, meaning they might be a little bit overweight, but they've got, pressure sensors on the cars that wouldn't ordinarily be raced because they want them on the car for the test. So, anything that gets raced throughout the course of the season can be used in those tests, but it has to be raced. So if we use two examples, we've got Ferrari and Racing Bulls or RB or whatever we're calling them today, Toro Rosso, AlphaTauri. I'm not sure what their name is, but Ferrari had an experimental floor towards the back end of the season, which was essentially a look at developments that had not worked previously when they had their old wind tunnel and they couldn't get those components to work when they brought them to the car in the real world. So they built an experimental floor that they wanted to look at some of those components now they've got the wind tunnel working properly, and would those parts correlate in the real world? Now, they found out that actually this floor might not be any better in terms of performance than the one they were already using. However, it wasn't any worse. So Leclerc actually raced it in one of the back end of the season races, and that then allowed them to to use it at the post-season test. So obviously they're then able to gather more data on that floor versus their current floor. So that's one area where obviously we're having a look at 25. However, the other team, as I've mentioned, Racing Bulls, had a new front wing available to them for Abu Dhabi. And it was quite conceptually very different to the one that they've been using. And it's probably a hint at how they're going to be looking at designing the front end of the car for 2025. Changes both the nose and all the outwash properties of the front wing. Now, to use that in the test, they would have had to have raced it. They didn't. So it did one free practice session. And that is one huge waste of money, in my opinion, because you've designed a whole new front wing assembly, a whole new nose, and it's literally got maybe half an hour in a free practice session to be evaluated by a driver. And that is pretty much all that they got out of it. So you've got two very different strategies there for the post-season test from two teams. And obviously there's other stuff going on elsewhere. But there's not really too much. We've had in the past where teams have done some crazy things going into the last race to be able to assess things going for the following season, but we didn't really have that this time round, unfortunately.
You can always hope and dream. And speaking of both hopes and dreams, before we get out of here, I did promise our listeners we would discuss the 26 regulations, because you said a very hilariously funny thing to me in our chat, which is, are you really a Formula One team if you haven't already designed your entire 2025 development season and are going to spend 25 only working on your 26 car?
Yeah. Are you really an F1 team if you haven't done that? And the answer to that is no, because when the clock strikes midnight on the 1st of January, as in it becomes the 1st of January 2025, you can start work on your 2026 car. And at that point, if you're not started work on your 2026 car, what are you doing? Because you should be, is the simple fact of the matter, because you want to get a head start on everything and beat your competitors, surely. So you want to push as much development as you can across to 26, but that means obviously sacrificing 25. So there's clearly going to be a bit of gaming going on between the teams in terms of what they're able to do for 25, how much you're prepared to give up for the future to gain in the present. It's a bit of a Scrooge mentality. What do you prefer, the past, present or future? And how do you go about it? And obviously it's interesting because we have recently had the new render released by the FIA on the 2026 car itself. So there are some changes compared to what they'd originally proposed, although we haven't actually had the technical regulations released as of yet to back that up.
Okay, but you have seen some of the elements and you've described them to me. So let's run through the car real quick. And the biggest thing, the thing that struck me most immediately, even from that render, is our Y2K vortex is gone. We're going back to like 2004, 2005 in terms of how it will look. Obviously, it's going to function a lot different.
Yeah, so aesthetically, I think we're probably turning the clock back 20 years, and these cars will very much look like sort of 2002, 2000 to 2006 sort of era cars in their design profile. But in terms of the actual changes that have been made to the cars between the two renders that have been released by the FIA, there's a new front wing end plate, winglet, which has taken the place of a small vane that was on the footplate. So obviously in the discussions that they've had between themselves and the teams, because they're helping out with the reorganisation of the regulations, they've decided that certain things or certain design criteria that the FIA had come up with were going to inhibit them in terms of delivering downforce, drag, etc., compared to where we are currently with lap times, and also based upon where we are with the 2026 power units, which, as we know, is the reason why we've got certain criteria within this particular set of regulations coming forward. So we've got things like the front wing and rear wing have been slightly tweaked. The rear wing's now more of a deltoid shape, which I think just kind of describes more or less what the teams will do with it, rather than the bog standard flat element that we saw originally. But we've also got 3 elements rather than 2 element rear wing, which again will come down to the active aero that will use in 26. You've got the front wheel covers will now be rims that go around the outside, the perimeter of the cover, rather than having a full cover like we've got now. And again, that will change the wake profile of the car and how the aerodynamic profile works. The outer floor fence has now been split into two rather than one, and is smaller than before. The floor is the biggest change. So previously we got sort of mini tunnels, which were very much a halfway house between the old regulations of 2021 past and 2022 with the full tunnels now and forward. And now we've gone back to a flat floor, something similar to what we had in 21. We've now real tunnels. That means we'll have an upturned leading edge to the floor with some fences to be able to redistribute the airflow around that part of the car. And then they've also increased, because obviously you've lost some capacity there, they've increased the diffuser size, they've enlarged the volume of it, bringing the kick line forward, and also changed some of the criteria around the rear wheels, etc., to deal with the fact that there'll be no tunnels. So very much we are somewhere in and around an aesthetic of the early 2000s, but with the regulation style of 2021, that sort of era. And I think technically the changes that have been made are very, very sound, obviously, but it has taken the teams to be involved to get to this point, to rectify some of the inefficiencies that we saw with the design that was originally intended.
Okay, so I do want to get into this a little bit, because my understanding was back in the day, Charlie Whiting would draw stuff on napkins and hand it off, and regulations would be written about that. And that would, broadly speaking, be fine. But that was more than a decade ago, 2 decades ago in some cases. And we were talking already about simulation tools. The FIA, under no circumstance, I'm sure, can afford the kind of tools you need to really properly design it. So outsourcing to the teams to look at the practical effects of what they're trying to achieve makes sense, because you're going to get feedback that's a lot more accurate than anything they could produce on their own. But having said that, you also pointed out that a lot of these changes are coming about because of the power unit regulations that are also changing. So explain to me what's going on with that. Why are we seeing? Why is the power unit regulations having this much to do with the aerodynamic regulations?
Okay, so let's just, for argument's sake, say we put a current power unit inside the proposed 2026 regulated cars. You would have similar performance envelope to what we have now, perhaps even a little better. What I'm basically saying is the 2026 power unit isn't as good as what we currently have. In as much as that it produces performance in a very different way. So to overcome the inefficiencies of the power unit, we needed to have adaptable aerodynamics to overcome those issues. That's why we will have an on and off mode for drag. So, you'll have effectively like a DRS activation for the front and rear wing when the car hits the straights. And that is because, obviously, if you didn't have that, the car would run out of energy before the end of the straight. And we don't want to see that. So it's all about having a car that is able to still perform at a similar level to where we are, but obviously with a power unit that is better in some ways, but worse in other ways. I think we will still end up with a product that is very similar to what we have now, but the racing will be very different because of the mastications of the aerodynamics and the power unit and how those two will work in tandem to be able to deliver that performance.
You are not filling me with hope about the racing at this moment. I was already prepared for a year or maybe 2 of one team just simply having figured things out better, because we generally see that sort of field spread back out when we get the new regulation sets. But it sounds like, and I know removing the MGUH makes the engines less efficient. Not doing regeneration on the front axle very much limits the amount of electrical energy that you can capture, which, is, and is this fundamentally, did we let the engine manufacturers run a little too freely in the candy store here?
Well, I think we've already had this discussion in the past, and yes is the answer to that question, because you don't. It was very much of a case of, let's have a look at what we want to develop here to be able to get new teams to come in and new manufacturers to come in and say that we want to enter the sport, because we believe that the bar is too high with what we currently have from a technological standpoint. However, in doing so, you dilute the product itself, and also then obviously require the aerodynamic and chassis regulations to meet criteria that assists that new power unit rather than enhancing that power unit. I think the one thing that most people will probably be the most upset about is the active aspect of the aerodynamics, because they will simply be a byproduct of how you drive the car, and the difference in performance is generated then between the power units. So how much energy you have as an overtake, essentially, to be able to overtake your competitors. I don't think that it's not an overtaking tool, the active aero. That is simply to allow the cars to operate on a performance envelope that is efficient from racetrack to racetrack. So, yeah, once again, I think we're in a situation where perhaps we've allowed the regulations to be framed in a way that isn't conducive to racing, and is more of a let's get around the problems afterwards situation.
Yeah, and this always brings up to me a long-time concern, and I think we sort of, not just you and me, but in many discussions I have, a sort of an eternal frustration with the way Formula One approaches all of its rules, really. And I just want to flag it up because I ran across a quote from Hyundai, who, after looking at it with someone who'd been in Formula One, has elected to race at the highest level of WEC. And they basically said, we are entering a phase where everything is possible with new powertrains. So this is the right moment to get, let's say, a different field to inspire us. And this is one of the big motivations of entering this category of motorsport racing. In other words, the rules in WEC allow the manufacturers to bring what they're good at to the table and race it. Whereas in Formula One, the very, very prescriptive nature here discourages people from coming and bringing what they have to offer that is their best. Is that something that, is it time finally for the FIA to have a serious think about this, in your opinion?
I think we've discussed this in the past as well, though, Matt. I do think that there is potential ways in which to improve how people see the power units and perceive the power units, and the merit of actually being a power unit provider within the sport. We have a Constructors' Championship, we have a Drivers' Championship, but we have nothing to suggest that the power unit has any merit at all within the sport. You don't have a power unit title, do you? So why would a power unit manufacturer want to be involved? We've been down this in the past with Red Bull and Renault, when Renault said, well, we didn't get anything in terms of credit for the championships that we won with Red Bull, and perhaps that was bad marketing on their side. However, I do think that there might be ways in which that you could allow the power unit manufacturers the scope to do so. However, I do think it's also a bit of a closed shop when it comes to power unit manufacturers, because of the amount of teams that have availability of power units. Mercedes have their own team. Ferrari have their own team. Honda are going to be working with Aston Martin. Ford are going to be working with Red Bull. So there's your power unit manufacturers. Alpine have decided that they don't want to be a power unit manufacturer anymore. So where do you go from there? Well, there has to be a limit on how many teams a power unit manufacturer supplies, or you have to accept the situation we're in now. There has to be some reward, though, for being a power unit manufacturer, and I think that's where perhaps things could change in the future. If you want to entice more people on board, you've got to make it worth their while to be there, spend the money and the resources, and have the accolades that go with it.
And I would just want to add, like, yes, from a marketing point of view, but also from what am I getting out of this for my road car division? And that's what struck me about the Hyundai statement, is that they're going there because they can take technologies they're actively using now on the road car division and learn about them. The research they're doing for that power unit is going to directly help their road car division. And it seems like to me in Formula One, that has drifted sort of farther and farther apart, and we're sort of trapped here.
Yeah, I mean, you are in a situation where you have to ask the question, has Formula One ever been road relevant? And the answer to that question is no. The answer to is, has Formula One technology ever passed down to road cars? And the answer is yes. So it's a reverse question that you have to ask in the Formula One terms. What will I learn in the future? Not what do I know now that I can apply to Formula One? And I think that's perhaps where Hyundai have basically made their statement, that they're able to apply some of the technology that they understand at this current stage and apply it to WEC, whereas that wouldn't be the case in Formula One. They would be coming along and having to learn a whole new set of parameters to be able to build something.
All right. Well, on that note, let me thank you very much for coming and spending all this time and sharing your knowledge. Where can we find you on the internet?
You can still find me on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it these days. And I am now on Blue Sky as well. Same handle, Summers F1.
And as for me, I'm always at MattPT55 on your socials. And remember, until next time, this has been Missed Apex Podcast.